We are adjourned, sine die.
The special session is over. We discuss pending proposals that could alter the budget negotiation landscape in Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's program. I'm Julie Bartke. State government shutdowns could be a thing of the past if one proposal becomes law. Senators Ted Lilly, Paul Gazelka, and Ted Daly announced recently a plan that would keep government open and operating in the event of a budget impasse.
From my perspective, I would like to make it a constitutional amendment. But whether it's an amendment or a statute, we know that we must do something and that we can do something. So never again for Minnesota.
I have had a conversation with Chairman Mike Perry of the state government, and that would be the first stop of this. And our thoughts are that we would probably start hearings very soon. These would not be, we would not be able to vote on this, but let's start getting public feedback on this right away while it's fresh in everybody's mind. And let's make sure that the public has some input into this, and that, of course, Pat, does include the Democrats and all of us.
Senator Ted Lilly is here on Capitol Report to discuss further his proposal that would essentially eliminate government shutdowns. Senator Lilly, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
First, let's begin with why you think your proposal is necessary.
Well, I think this proposal is absolutely necessary. We've just come through the longest shutdown in recent history in the state of Minnesota and nationally. We're also watching what's happening on the federal and the national stage, and it's mirroring what has happened in Minnesota this year. The citizens of Minnesota, the businesses of Minnesota have been impacted by this shutdown greatly. Our parks have been shut down, our roadside rests have been shut down, 22,000 state workers have been out of a job. State services have not been there. Businesses have been hindered because they couldn't get proper approval for different things that they were working on. And the citizens just got very frustrated with what was happening. We were shut down for 3 weeks, for 20 days, and we just can't afford to have this again.
Okay, so let's talk about your vision as you begin to craft this legislation. What happens, for example, if there's a budget surplus or a shortfall? You know, your proposal has programs and services funded at current levels. What if that is indeed not the reality?
Yeah. Well, actually, we're going to go back to the 2005 shutdown. And following that shutdown, the Lieutenant Governor, Yvonne Pretner-Solon, came forward with a proposal to do the same thing. And what we've done this time is I've taken her language. We didn't really change a thing except for the years. And what this does is it basically says that in the event that the governor and the legislature cannot come to an agreement, cannot come to a solution, then funding should continue at the same level as has been there before. So the funding that was there in May should be enough funding to keep us going through June, July, and August while we continue to talk about that resolution. So in my proposal, it's at 100% of the current funding. Now that being said, some are proposing 80%, 90%. The number we can talk about. Senator Gazelka is suggesting that we have a constitutional amendment. So there are a number of proposals that are out there, but the basic foundation of the concept is let's not let this happen to the people of Minnesota again. We cannot afford to have this happen. So in my proposal, we're proposing that the funding would continue at 100% of what it was before until there is a resolution or until there is a solution.
And it would go indefinitely if there isn't?
It could go indefinitely, but there's going to be a lot of incentive for the governor and for the legislature to find a solution.
Such as?
Well, for instance, on the federal level, they're talking about a trigger event. And the trigger event is that if they cannot come to terms, then in that situation there would be half the funding, half the change would be coming from the military, half would be coming from social programs and things like that. I think there's plenty of incentive to find a solution and to find a resolution already.
Have you been having conversations with each of the caucuses about this, just to gauge level of interest? As you mentioned, there are several proposals out there.
Yes. What we will plan to do, I have talked with Chairman Perry, chair of the State Government Innovations Committee, and he is planning to hold a committee meeting this fall to talk about this and to flesh it out and see what direction we want to go. And then in our next session, next January, we'll start to talk about this concept and we'll come up with caucus positions. shutdowns. But what we're talking about really should have bipartisan support. And if we do it at 100%, then we're not cutting anything, we're just leaving the funding at the same levels as already exist, as already are there in statute. So there should not be a political bias to this.
I want to talk a little bit about what you, as a freshman legislator, learned from everything, from the special session, the shutdown, and the subsequent negotiations that happened in those final days of that special session.
Well, one of the things that happened is in the shutdown, the Capitol was closed, and it was not open to the public. And by not being open to the public, people were not able to watch what was happening in those rooms. So it was a closed door, and some called it a cone of silence. And I think that's kind of a funny term, but basically what happened is the public was not invited in to see the process as it was happening, to have input into it. Now, that being said, there were, most of what was discussed in closed doors had already been openly discussed during the session. So a lot of that was already out in the public. But that can't happen. That's a constitutional crisis. I really believe firmly in that. That this should be open. We have open meeting laws. They should apply in this situation also.
And so that leads to my next question, which to some extent you just answered. Do you then support a bill that's sponsored by Senator John Marty, and co-authored by Senator Sandy Pappas that would essentially eliminate this cone of silence and everything would be done transparently?
Yes. I have not seen that bill, so I'd like to see that bill. As most of your viewers probably know, I probably don't agree on a lot of things that John Marty does, but an open meeting process, absolutely. I think it's crucially important that government happen in the open. Our founders assured us that that would happen. We have many state laws that provide for that, and it did not happen in this case. So to me, having this shutdown avoidance policy, which by the way, there are 12 other states who already do this. Wisconsin is a state that has this policy in place. It's working very effectively. There's still an incentive to solve the situation, to solve the budget. Still a process of discussing the pros and cons of different proposals, but it happens in the open. By having this process, it happens in the open, and I think that's very important.
And I find it interesting, you were included in some of those closed-door discussions at the end of the regular session.
Yes.
And so do you think that what was said in that room is something, and some of the things that were said and some of the negotiations that took place, could they happen if this were done publicly?
I think government is a messy business. Some talk about that it's sausage making. And I think that some parts of this process need to be done between those vested parties, but other parts need to be very open. So I don't know historically that these negotiations, the internal workings of the negotiations, have ever been in public. I think they've been in private for many governors, many legislators of both parties. So I think that has been the process, but the overall legislative process should be in the open. It should be openly discussed and should be participated by the public.
Okay, Senator Lilly, we'll follow your proposal, of course, next session. Thanks for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The term cone of silence became prevalent at the end of the last legislative session when behind closed door budget negotiations took place. Senator Sandy Pappas is co-author of a bill that would eliminate this. Senator, thanks for joining us today to talk about your proposal.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's begin with this cone of silence. Historically and traditionally, it's been prevalent in the past, so why is it a problem?
Well, we have had open meeting law since 1972. This would just be I would say this is a pretty strict violation of, if not the letter of the open meeting law, certainly the spirit of the open meeting law.
And now critics would argue that many of those discussions that take place behind closed doors actually do take place prior to, in different committees and conference committees, et cetera, and on the floors as well. So in their opinion, there is some transparency, although some new elements may be brought in in these budget negotiations. What's your thought on that argument?
Well, it at least in that case, even if there are some private discussions, you have a public airing of the issues. I was pretty shocked that going into the special session, there were no public meetings at all on anything that was going to be in the bill. There were no public discussions. In fact, the whole Capitol was locked down. The public couldn't even have access to the building. So I thought it was pretty outrageous.
And Senator Ted Lilly, we just spoke to him prior to speaking with you, and he agrees with the concept of the bill, although he doesn't know the language. And it was introduced during special session. It's already been referred to the Rules Committee. So how optimistic are you that this bill can get a hearing and that you can get some bipartisan support on it?
Well, it sounds like we might have some bipartisan support because the Republicans and the Democrats were both really locked out of most of the discussion. Just the leaders did the negotiation with the governor and the commissioners, and that's not really part of the democratic process. I mean, there were some surprises. There were not a lot of surprises because a lot of the bills had been vetted and had hearings during the regular legislative session. So what's the big secret? Why not have public hearings? Why not invite the public in to comment? The public will often spot mistakes, not just policy they disagree with, but actual mistakes that no one intended. And that's why it's important to have an open process.
You speak about mistakes, and one such that just came into my head this moment was several years ago in some of those closed-door meetings. One happened with the tax portion of the bill, and it was Green Acres, and that mistake was then corrected a few years later. So is that kind of the spirit of this legislation then?
Right. I saw something about in the Human Services Law, there was some unintended provision, and the chair of the committee in the House said, well, I hope that they won't implement that until we can look into it, until we can figure it out. I noticed that in the higher ed bill, there was a provision on guaranteed tuition. I thought, where did that come from? I don't remember that passing the Senate or the House or being in the conference committee. So maybe my memory's wrong, but I think if we had a public hearing, then we could ask questions about, where did this provision come from and what's the rationale for it and why is it in there and what kind of impact is it going to have?
So as former chair of the Higher Ed Committee, the Senate Higher Ed Committee, you've been involved in some of these private negotiations. So what's your vision and what do you think?
Well, very minimally. I mean, if maybe I was on call, I might get a phone call and be asked my opinion. But really, the minority was not included, and most of the majority members were not in the room and included.
What about in the past when you were part of the majority?
Well, when we had special sessions, and we're talking about a special session here, we always had at least a hearing in front of the Finance Committee and the Tax Committee to go over the provisions if the individual committees didn't meet. We had public hearings. If you meet in the House and the Senate as the committee of the whole, the public can't testify, the public can't comment. Some of these bills weren't even online. We delayed a couple hours so that they were online, but the delay was from 9 o'clock at night until 1 o'clock in the morning. Who's paying attention at that time of night? I mean, I think that if we're going to have any legislation, we should have things about not having floor sessions at 3 in the morning.
So, Senator, I do want to get your opinion as well on Senator Lilly's proposal. We spoke to him earlier in the program, and his bill would essentially, or proposal at this time, would essentially eliminate government shutdowns and continue funding critical services and government at current levels if there's an impasse between the governor and the legislature. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe Lieutenant Governor Pretner-Solon, when she was in the Senate, had a similar proposal, and I think it's worth looking at. In reality, the courts, it was very hard for them and very difficult for them and a lot of work for them, but they kept critical services, probably 80% of government was open during the shutdown regardless. So I think it makes sense to do that to cause least level of disruption. I was on a higher ed tour in June, and they were all concerned about the shutdown. In the middle of that tour, the notice came that management and budget was still going to be cutting checks for the state colleges and universities so they wouldn't shut down in the middle of the summer. And there was a great sense of relief because it would be very disruptive to students' academic work that they're in the middle of. So I definitely think it's worth looking at.
All right, thank you for that insight, and thank you for your time, Senator Pappas. We appreciate it.
Happy to come anytime.
Long Longtime State Senator Linda Berglund has been a predominant figure in health care reform here in Minnesota, and she recently announced she is stepping down. Last week, we aired a portion of our interview with the senator. Well, today, we'd like to air the rest of her thoughts on this past legislative session and the future of health care. Senator Linda Berglund, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
You know, during your tenure in public office, you served with 7 different governors. You saw one president of the United States resign from public office, and you saw the first Black American sworn in as president of the United States. In your opinion, is this country and the state better off today than it was in 1972 when you were first elected?
Well, there are things that have changed for the better, and there are things that have changed for the worse. You know, in 1972, we didn't have all of the home and community-based services that we have today to help our elders and disabled citizens be able to live and be full contributing members of our communities. So this is a good thing that we have.
Let's move on and talk a little bit about how the institution of the Senate has changed since you were first elected here in 1980.
Well, there weren't as many women. Needless to say, I'm glad there are more women now and that it's more of a usual thing, not an anomaly, not something to talk about even. I think there's more decentralization of power in terms of, you know, having more participation by members in the decisions that are made. I think it's been a hard last 9 years with budget after budget needing to be cut and deficit after deficit. So I'm hoping we can recover from that and be having times that are a little easier in the future.
Okay, and now one of your major accomplishments while in the Senate was the creation of the state's Minnesota Care program. It helps provide health coverage to low-income Minnesotans. Do you think this program has become the envy of other states?
There are a lot of other states that would like to have a program like this, and there are other states that have had a program like this and don't have it anymore. So yes, I think so. And it will be helpful to us when federal health reform does go into place to have people already in some kind of coverage so that they'll be able to transition and our budget will be able to transition more easily.
Any concern it might get dismantled when you're no longer here?
Well, I did not think the repeal of the Minnesota Care tax in this year's budget bill was a good thing. We are going to need that money for implementing federal reform and for making sure that we continue to have coverage for everyone. But I believe there will be others that will be ready and willing to step up to the plate. And because it is a good program that many people all over the state rely on, and maybe not for a long time even, but just for a hard time during their life when they're unemployed maybe, or have to take a job without health benefits. I've heard from a lot of people that have said, you know, it helped me for a couple of years and I really needed it then. So I believe the program will continue in some form, and that the people in the legislature and Governor Dayton's administration will step up to the plate to make sure that it remains a viable program.
And since healthcare is your area of expertise, how do you respond when most folks, Republicans and Democrats, agree that the cost trajectory of healthcare spending is unsustainable? What's your response and perhaps your advice to direct lawmakers down the road?
Well, the first thing I would say is that cutting rates to providers and cutting eligibility for certain programs in healthcare or cutting people off altogether, that does not amount to health reform. What health reform is about is providing services differently to keep people with chronic conditions healthy and helping them be a partner with them in their own health so that they can remain productive citizens and they don't end up in an emergency room, they don't end up in a hospital unnecessarily. And making those changes in the delivery system is not easy. It's not easy for anybody to change, but it's certainly not easy for a system that is not very well organized, as medicine is, to change. And I believe also that in order for this to work well, people need not only health care, but they need social services brought in. So, you know, if you're homeless, pretty hard to be healthy if you don't have a place to live that's safe.
Given that you are such a champion for health care, particularly for the state's most vulnerable, how difficult of a decision was it for you to move on and leave the Senate at this time?
Well, the position that I have taken gives me an opportunity to serve many of the same people and to work on many of the same things that I'm passionate about, but to do it closer to the ground and to actually see policies that I have hoped would be implemented actually being implemented. So
Same work, different structure.
yes, I'm excited about the new opportunity.
And congratulations on your new post, and thanks so much for joining us today. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've discussed some pending legislation in this week's program, and tracking bills when session is underway can be a complicated process. John Brune provides details that should make that process a bit easier.
A bill is a formal document produced during the legislative process, meant to meet specific constitutional and legislative requirements. Wading through the legalese of a bill is common practice for legislators, lobbyists, and staff, but it can be a confusing undertaking for those with only occasional interest in specific issues. Following is a short guide to help you navigate the formalities of legislation and better understand the language of a bill.
From the public's perspective, it's important to know that the bill contains lots of finding aids that will help you navigate through a particular bill. The best way to do it, obviously, is look at the first page of the bill, something called the title is. At the beginning, at the top of the bill, it'll be styled a bill for an act relating to, and then it will tell you the general subject of the bill. And then it will be followed by a very brief statement of the purpose of the bill, what's in the bill. And while that's a very good first step, people should not rely on the title alone to tell them what's in a bill. It's not a complete index to the bill, but it'll give you a pretty good idea of what's included in the bill. Usually the bill is organized into chunks of discrete material that relates to the rest of it. It's usually done by article numbers. If you look in a bill, the bill will be separated by articles. They're numbered consecutively, and usually after the article number there will be a brief catch-all. It's not part of the law, but it's an alert to the reader about the subject matter that follows. That's very helpful when looking through a big piece of legislation to find out what those general captions are. In each article then, the material is organized by bill section numbers, and they're presented sequentially. And as you march through the section numbers, you can see the areas of law that are amended. And again, there are finding aids there that will help you. They'll give you a little clue about the material. Every section of law that's being amended and any subdivision of law that's being amended will be followed by again, a catch-all. It's not part of the law, but it's helpful information for people, usually in bold, and it will give you a summary of what the material that follows relates to. And so simply by looking at the organization of the document and the editorial heads that are provided, you get a pretty good understanding of what's in the document. When you look at a bill, you will notice that there will be a series of numbers on the left-hand margin. There are two whole numbers, usually separated by a period. And the number to the left of the period indicates the page number that you're on. You can also look at the bottom of the page because each legislative bill has a page number there. But also there's a whole number to the right of the period, and that indicates the line number. So if you're following a debate in committee or on the floor and a member refers to a specific page or line number in the discussion, you can merely follow along through the bill, find the appropriate page and line number as listed in that margin, and you'll know exactly where they're talking about. There are other finding aids that you can use in conjunction with the page and line numbers. If you look at the bottom of a page in a bill, you'll not only see the page number, but on the left-hand lower corner, you will see a section number or sometimes an article in section number if the bill is divided into articles. That's a shorthand way for you to jump through material to get, generally to the portion of the bill that you're talking about, and then you would use the page and line numbers to more narrowly focus your attention to the specific provisions that are being referred to. The convention that the legislature follows in proposing new language or removing or altering existing language follows a very definite pattern. Every time that new law is being proposed to be added, that material will be underscored. So that's a key. If you see underscored material, these are new proposals. Anytime an existing provision of law is to be removed from the law, you will see it stricken through. And again, because these are working documents, it's very important for everybody involved in the process to understand what those changes are. So in every version of the document that's worked on in either the Senate or the House, every time that body officially takes action on the bill by modifying it somehow, either by adding material or removing from it, that convention is followed so that those changes can be integrated into the bill and a new copy of the bill can be produced that reflects all the changes. And that's another important thing for the public to understand. Make sure that you have the correct version of the document, because again, these are working documents and sometimes you're looking at them as they're working their way through the process. It's important to understand that you have the latest version that the legislature is working off of. It's also important always to read the definition sections that usually begin at the beginning of a bill. It'll give you, again, a general sense of the terms that the legislature is using. Everything in the body of the bill is important. It's part of the law that either is being amended, proposed, or repealed. I'd also always look at the end of the document. The end of the document contains the administrative provisions, when the bill will be effective, how the bill or the law that's being proposed relates to existing law. Sometimes existing law is repealed. If you happen to be looking at a written copy of the document, sometimes all of the sections of law that are being repealed will be displayed there. Again, it's very useful also. So all of those things go into giving you an indication of what the bill is about without having to read a word for word the text of it. The legislature has a wealth of information that's available to the public. If you do not have internet access, the House Public Information Office, the Senate Information Office are wonderful resources to get copies of bills, to get information about the bill status, where the bill is, when it's being heard, where it is in the process. The Revisor's Office, we've talked a lot about why bills look the way they do. The Revisor's Office, by law, publishes a bill drafting manual that explains in more detail why bills look the way they do. I'd encourage people to call the Revisor's Office and maybe send a copy of the bill drafting manual.
The state legislature has many options to help guide you through the legislative process. These helpful websites and public information offices can assist you to find the specific information you need.
And that wraps up another program. From all of us here at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Barkey. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.